The evening air was thick with tension as Marcus and his dog, Shadow, strolled through the dimly lit streets of a quiet neighborhood. The sounds of the city faded into the background, replaced by the rhythmic patter of Shadow's paws against the pavement. It was supposed to be just another walk, a peaceful break from the chaos of the day. Marcus, tall, broad-shouldered, and seemingly out of place in this part of town, kept his head low, lost in his thoughts. Shadow, a massive Rottweiler with a sleek black coat, was more than just a companion. He was a protector. They shared an unspoken bond, one forged through countless days and nights together. They had been through a lot. Marcus wasn't just any ordinary man. Beneath his calm demeanor was a history that could send shivers down anyone's spine, a history he preferred to keep hidden. But tonight, none of that seemed important. Tonight, he only wanted a peaceful walk, a chance to unwind. That's when they appeared. A gang of young men, loud and brash, appeared out of nowhere. Their footsteps echoed through the empty streets, their voices carrying an unmistakable edge. They were not just walking, they were searching. Searching for someone to bully, someone to intimidate, someone they could make feel small. And that person turned out to be Marcus. They didn't know who he was, not yet. But the moment they saw him, they made a snap judgment. He was an easy target. A man walking alone with a dog, surely someone they could take on without any consequences. "You lost, buddy." One of them sneered, his voice laced with arrogance. Marcus didn't respond right away. His eyes briefly flickered to the group, sizing them up. There were 5 of them, all younger, all eager to prove something. Marcus could feel the anger rising in his chest, but he kept his composure. He had been trained not to react, trained to stay calm, to avoid escalating situations. But Shadow, sensing his owner's tension, let out a low growl. The leader of the group smirked. "Nice dog, man. What's his name?" he asked, stepping closer. Marcus stood his ground. "Shadow," he muttered, his voice barely audible. The gang's laughter echoed through the streets. "Shadow, huh? I bet he's just as useless as you are," another member mocked, stepping forward and getting in Marcus's face. Marcus's heart raced. He could already feel the weight of the situation shifting, the tension in the air thickening. His instincts, honed over years of combat training, told him that this was not going to end well. His hand twitched, itching to reach for something, anything, that could end this conflict quickly. But there was nothing. Not a weapon, not a backup. Just him and Shadow, facing down a gang that didn't know who they were messing with. The situation spiraled quickly. One of the men shoved Marcus hard, knocking him off balance. Shadow barked furiously, lunging forward, his teeth bared in warning. The gang leader laughed, his eyes glinting with malicious amusement. "You gonna let your dog do all the talking?" he taunted, stepping even closer. "What's wrong? Cat got your tongue." Marcus's patience was running thin. He knew where this was headed. He had dealt with far worse, but these guys weren't backing down, and their aggression was escalating by the second. Shadow, now fully alert and protective, growled louder, his massive body tense with the need to strike. The leader's smile faded as he noticed the change in Shadow's posture. He looked down at the dog, then back up at Marcus. For a brief moment, something like doubt flickered across his face, but he quickly masked it with bravado. But it was too late. One of the gang members, eager to show off, took a swing at Marcus, connecting with a glancing blow to his jaw. The impact sent a jolt of pain through Marcus's skull, but it was nothing compared to what he had endured in his past. Without thinking, he retaliated. His training kicked in, muscle memory taking over. A swift knee to the chest of his attacker sent the young man stumbling backward. Before the others could react, Marcus was on the move, every movement fluid, controlled, and deadly. Shadow was right behind him, knocking another attacker to the ground with a single swipe of his powerful paw. The gang's bravado quickly turned into confusion, then fear. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected Marcus to fight back like this. But still, they didn't know who he was. As Marcus took down one of the men with a series of expertly timed strikes, the others hesitated, sizing him up. Their eyes widened as they realized just how dangerous this man was. This wasn't some random guy. This wasn't someone they could push around. They were in over their heads. One of the gang members reached into his jacket, pulling out a knife. "You're dead now, man," he yelled, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. Marcus's eyes narrowed. This was no longer just a street confrontation. This had turned into a fight for survival. His hand shot out, grabbing the wrist of the attacker and twisting with a precision that left the man howling in pain. The knife fell to the ground, but Marcus wasn't done. Another punch, another kick, and the gang leader was on the ground, clutching his stomach. Marcus stood over him, breathing heavily, his eyes cold and unforgiving. The remaining gang members looked at each other, the realization dawning on them that they were not just dealing with any man. They were up against someone far more dangerous than they could imagine. The tension in the air was thick, the kind that made you feel like the ground beneath you could crack open at any moment. But what they didn't know was that Marcus wasn't just any man. He wasn't some random civilian. He was a soldier, a killer. One of the army's deadliest weapons, trained in combat tactics that most could only dream of understanding. And he had been trained for this very moment. Just as the last gang member hesitated, Marcus heard the distant sound of sirens wailing in the distance, growing louder by the second. The game was changing, and it was clear the gang had underestimated him in every possible way. But just as Marcus was about to make his final move, something unexpected happened. Shadow, who had been silent for a moment, suddenly barked sharply, his ears standing straight up. Marcus froze, looking down at his loyal companion, who was now staring into the shadows ahead, a low growl rumbling from his chest. Something was coming. Before Marcus could react, the sound of footsteps filled the air. More people, more danger. Who were they? And why were they coming for Marcus? In that brief moment of uncertainty, the tension that had been building for so long reached a boiling point. The air was charged with electricity, and Marcus, despite his training, couldn't shake the feeling that this night was far from over. His hand instinctively reached for the knife that had fallen to the ground moments earlier, but there was no time to think. The gang was no longer the only threat. Something much bigger, much more dangerous, was lurking in the shadows. And Marcus was about to find out just how deep this rabbit hole went. Stay tuned, because what happens next will change everything. The footsteps grew louder, and Marcus's senses went into overdrive. His body tensed, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. But this time, it wasn't just the gang members who had his attention. His eyes flicked from one corner of the street to the other, searching for any sign of movement, any shift in the shadows. Shadow, ever the faithful companion, stood by his side, eyes trained on the same spot. There was something there, something lurking in the darkness that neither of them could quite put their finger on. The gang members, now scattered across the ground, either writhing in pain or trembling in fear, seemed to sense it too. Their bravado had evaporated, replaced by uncertainty. They had underestimated Marcus, that much was clear, but now they were beginning to realize that this wasn't just a street brawl anymore. This was something far bigger. The silence between them stretched taut, the calm before the storm. The sound of footsteps was now unmistakable, a steady, deliberate pace, echoing off the walls of the empty buildings that surrounded them. Whoever it was, they weren't in any hurry. They knew they had the advantage. Marcus took a step back, keeping his eyes on the approaching figures, but his mind was elsewhere, remembering a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. The harsh clang of gunfire, the relentless hum of helicopters overhead, the smell of burning metal and oil. He had been in situations like this before. Dangerous situations, yes, but none quite like this. Back in the army, he had been trained to expect the unexpected, to read the signs, to move with precision, to strike before anyone even realized they had made a mistake. But what he hadn't been prepared for was this. The men approaching him weren't soldiers, not in any traditional sense. They didn't move like soldiers. They didn't have the discipline or the calm that came with years of military training. No, these men were something else entirely. The first man to step into view was tall, cloaked in the shadows of the alleyway. He wore a long dark coat, the collar turned up against the cold night air. His face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but there was no mistaking the way he moved. Fluid, deliberate, controlled. He stopped just a few feet from Marcus, his eyes gleaming from beneath the brim of his hat, studying him with an unsettling calm. "You're the one," the man said, his voice low and gravelly, but not unfriendly. Marcus didn't answer right away. He couldn't. There was something about the man's presence that felt all wrong, like he knew far too much about Marcus, about his past, his training, everything that made him dangerous. "Do you know who I am?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but his pulse racing in his chest. The man nodded, just once, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "I do, and I think you know exactly who we are. You've been looking for us, haven't you?" Marcus's grip tightened around the knife he'd retrieved earlier. He wasn't sure where this was going, but he had learned to trust his instincts, and right now, they were screaming at him to prepare for anything. Shadow growled low in his throat, sensing the shift in the air, but Marcus placed a hand on the dog's head, urging him to stay calm. He didn't want to escalate the situation, yet. The other figures in the shadows began to step forward, revealing themselves one by one. They were all dressed similarly, dark clothing, face coverings, and an air of mystery that hung around them like a thick fog. There were 5 of them in total, but despite their numbers, there was no sense of threat from them. It was as if they were in control of the situation, and Marcus was the one who was out of place. The man with the hat stepped closer, until he was within arm's reach of Marcus. "You've been good at running from your past," he said, his eyes narrowing. "But you can't outrun it forever." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He knew exactly what the man was talking about. He had spent years trying to outrun the things he'd done, the people he hurt. The missions that had haunted him, the people who had relied on him, and who had paid the ultimate price for it. He had never wanted anyone to know what he had been trained for, what he was capable of. "You're one of them, aren't you?" Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're connected to the military, or at least to something like it." The man with the hat chuckled darkly. "We're connected to much more than that, Marcus, much more. You see, we know who you are, what you've done, what you're capable of, and now we need you." Marcus's grip on the knife tightened even further. He wasn't sure whether to be relieved or terrified. He had been right. These people weren't just random thugs. They were something else entirely. The question was, what did they want with him? What did they know? Shadow barked again, his low growl turning into an insistent warning. But Marcus didn't have time to acknowledge the dog's instincts. His mind was already racing, trying to make sense of the situation. "We've been watching you for a long time," the man continued, his voice almost conspiratorial. "We've been watching your every move, waiting for you to slip up. But you haven't. You've been so careful, so calculated, but now the time has come. It's time for you to face your past. It's time for you to join us." Marcus's mind flashed back to the moments before, his instincts telling him this night wasn't just a random encounter. This wasn't just a gang picking on the wrong guy. No, this was something far bigger. The streets were only the surface. Whatever lay beneath was far more dangerous. He glanced at the gang members, who were now sitting on the ground, dazed and confused. They had no idea what was happening, what was unfolding before them. They were just pawns in a much larger game. "Who are you?" Marcus demanded, his voice finally breaking through the tension. The man's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "We're the ones who've been pulling the strings, Marcus. We're the ones who've been setting everything into motion. We've been waiting for you to come to us, to acknowledge the power that you possess." Marcus shook his head, trying to make sense of the words. "I don't know what you're talking about. I have no part in whatever this is. The man's smile faded, and for a moment, his eyes turned cold, calculating. You don't have a choice. You're already in it. You've always been in it. The question is, do you want to stay on the sidelines, or do you want to embrace who you really are? You've spent so many years trying to run from your past, but it's time to face it. Marcus's breath quickened. This wasn't just some recruiting pitch. These people weren't interested in making him an ally or a friend. They wanted to use him. And whatever this organization was, they had no intention of letting him walk away. The tension in the air was suffocating, the silence hanging heavy between them. Shadow barked again, more urgently this time, but Marcus barely registered the sound. His mind was racing, trying to formulate a plan. He needed to get out of here. He needed to think. But he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever this was, it wasn't something he could escape. The man with the hat took a step closer, his voice soft and persuasive. You've been trained for this, Marcus. You've always been meant for something bigger, something greater. You can't hide forever. Why me? Marcus shot back, his voice barely controlled. Why me, and why now? The man's eyes glinted with something Marcus couldn't quite decipher. Because you're the key, the one we've been waiting for. You're the most lethal weapon the army has ever created, and we need someone like you to help us finish what we started. At that moment, Marcus knew he was standing on the edge of something far darker than he could have ever imagined. The question wasn't whether he could survive this night. It was whether he could survive the secrets that were about to be revealed. And deep down, he knew that this encounter, this meeting with a mysterious group, would change the course of his life forever. Marcus could feel the weight of their eyes on him, each of the figures watching him like vultures, waiting for him to make a decision. His mind was racing, every instinct in his body screaming at him to run, to get out of there, to leave the gang behind and escape whatever this twisted game had become. But the truth was, he couldn't outrun this. This wasn't just some random encounter, some street-level scuffle. No, this was bigger, deeper. He could feel it in his bones. These people knew things about him, things that no one else did, and they weren't here for idle threats. The man in the hat stepped forward again, his cold eyes fixed on Marcus. You've spent so many years pretending you were just another guy, he said, his voice smooth like oil. But the truth is, you're a soldier, Marcus. You've been trained for things most people can't even fathom. And we need that. We need you to finish what's been started. Marcus's throat tightened. The words rang in his ears, echoing like a drumbeat. What do you want from me? He asked, barely able to keep his voice steady. You think I'm some kind of weapon? You think I've just been sitting around waiting for you to come knock on my door? The man's lips curled into a smile, a cruel, knowing smile. You've been running from this your whole life, haven't you? But the world's a mess, Marcus, and you're the only one who can fix it. Fix it. Marcus spat. By what? Killing people. You think that's what I'm meant to do? The man tilted his head, as if considering the question. Killing people. No, Marcus. You're meant to lead, to change things, to take control of what's falling apart. There's more at stake than you can imagine, and the truth is, you've been running from it for far too long. Marcus clenched his fists, trying to steady his breathing. He had to think, had to find a way out. He couldn't get tangled in whatever this was. Whatever this man's plan was, it wasn't his fight. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was just a man with a dog, trying to live his life. But Shadow's growl cut through the tension, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the air. The dog's eyes were fixed on the newcomers, his body tense, and for a moment, Marcus felt the briefest flicker of doubt. Shadow had never been wrong before. If there was danger ahead, Shadow would know. Before Marcus could say another word, the man in the hat raised his hand, silencing him with a single gesture. The gang members, who had been watching from the sidelines, were still on the ground, dazed and confused. But they weren't irrelevant. No, they were a part of this too. They were part of the bigger picture. You see, the man said, turning slightly to address the rest of the group, these men are only the beginning. This city, This country is a powder keg waiting to blow. The cracks are already showing, but we have the power to stop it, to shape the world in a way that makes sense. Marcus's stomach churned. The words were chilling. He could feel it in his gut now, the manipulation, the pull of something far bigger than any fight he'd ever faced. He wasn't just dealing with a group of thugs. These people were calculating, ruthless. They wanted something, and they were willing to do whatever it took to get it. "You're talking about power," Marcus said, his voice rough. "What do you want from me? I'm not going to join your little revolution or whatever this is." The man's expression softened slightly, but his eyes still held that unnerving calm. "It's not about joining, Marcus. It's about what's coming next. You know it as much as I do. The world is crumbling. We can either sit back and watch it burn, or we can do something about it. We've been planning for this for years, and you've been part of it the whole time." Marcus shook his head, a cold sweat forming on his brow. "I don't know what you think I am, but you've got the wrong guy." For a moment, the man said nothing. He just studied Marcus, as though he were a puzzle piece that wasn't quite fitting into place. "You're more than just a soldier, more than just a weapon. You've been trained to lead, to make choices that others count. This world needs that now more than ever." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the stomach. He had never asked for any of this. He hadn't asked for the training, the missions, the blood on his hands. All he wanted was peace. A life away from the chaos. A life with Shadow, where he could leave the past behind. But these people, whoever they were reminding him of a reality he had been desperately trying to forget. He stepped back, his mind racing. His fingers brushed the handle of the knife, still in his hand, and he could feel the heat of the blade against his palm. But he wasn't sure if he could fight his way out of this. Not with these people. Not with this group. There were too many of them, too much at stake. For a moment, he wondered if they were right. Maybe he was the key to something. Maybe he had been trained for this kind of life all along, only he hadn't known it. Maybe this was his purpose. But then he remembered the quiet life he had built, the small moments of peace he had fought for, and he knew he couldn't let it go, not without a fight. "I'm not your guy," Marcus said again, this time with more conviction. He turned to leave, his heart pounding in his chest, and motioned for Shadow to follow him. The dog hesitated for a moment, looking back at the group, but then followed Marcus, his tail tucked low. But just as Marcus took his first step away, the man's voice rang out again, sharper this time. "You can walk away, Marcus, but you won't be able to escape this. You'll never be free of it. It's already in motion. The world is changing, and you can either be part of that change or be crushed by it." Marcus froze, his back to the man, the words hanging in the air like a noose. He could feel the weight of them, the gravity of what was being asked of him, and for a moment he felt the pull of something darker, something deeper. But then the sound of a car's engine cut through the tension, the sudden noise slicing through the night air like a knife. The headlights of a vehicle blinked to life, illuminating the street. It was coming from behind them, fast, relentless, and on a direct course for Marcus and his group. The man in the hat raised his hand, and the group instantly fell into a defensive stance, their eyes darting to the approaching vehicle. Marcus didn't wait. He knew this was his chance. He grabbed Shadow's leash, yanking the dog forward as he sprinted toward the alleyway, his pulse racing. He could hear the pounding of feet behind him, the sound of people shouting, but he didn't look back. The car screeched to a halt just as Marcus and Shadow disappeared into the shadows. He didn't know who was in that car. He didn't care. But what he did know was that whatever was coming for him, whatever this was, it wasn't over. It had just begun, and he was running out of time. Marcus's heart hammered in his chest as he pushed forward, the alleyway growing darker with each step. Shadow was right behind him, his heavy breathing matching the urgency of Marcus's own. They didn't stop to look back. The screech of the car's tires was still ringing in his ears, but the noise wasn't the only thing that unsettled him. There was something deeper, something in the way the man with the hat had spoken that clawed at his mind. Asterisk the world is changing asterisk. Those words echoed through his thoughts like a warning, but Marcus couldn't figure out what it meant or how he was supposed to stop it. They rounded another corner, the city streets stretching before them in an almost endless expanse. The lights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows along the cracked pavement. Everything felt off. Marcus could feel the eyes of the world on him, watching, waiting for him to make the next move. He didn't know who was in that car or what kind of danger he had just narrowly avoided, but he wasn't naive enough to think that they wouldn't be after him again. He paused for a moment, taking a breath, his hand on his knee as he looked down at Shadow. The dog's panting had slowed, but his alertness was unwavering. Marcus knew that he wasn't just running from those people in the alley. He was running from something bigger, something far more dangerous than he could even begin to comprehend. He glanced up, scanning the street ahead. The streetlights cast eerie glows on the empty sidewalks, and a chill had begun to creep into the air. He could hear the soft rustle of the wind, but other than that, the world felt oddly still. Too still. A noise broke the silence, a distant sound, too faint to identify, but enough to make Marcus freeze. His breath caught in his throat as his instincts screamed at him. Asterisk not alone asterisk. Shadow growled softly, his ears flicking toward the sound. Marcus didn't hesitate. He pulled the dog closer to him, stepping into a nearby doorway to hide, his body pressed flat against the wall. The tension was thick in the air, every muscle in his body coiled tight, ready for whatever came next. The sound grew louder, the echo of boots hitting the pavement unmistakable. Someone was moving fast, too calculated. He could hear the faint hiss of a breath, the subtle shift of weight on the ground. Then came the soft thud of a door closing. Someone was in the alley behind them, but who? Marcus's eyes narrowed as he scanned the dimly lit street. There, across the way, in the shadows of the storefronts, he saw the flicker of movement, too deliberate to be an accident. He wasn't just being followed, he was being hunted. The footsteps grew louder, closer. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It was no longer just a group of random individuals after him. These were people who knew exactly who he was, who knew exactly what he was capable of. His mind raced, trying to recall everything the man with the hat had said. Asterisk you, the key asterisk he had said. Asterisk you've been trained to lead asterisk, but lead what? And to what end? Marcus didn't have time to answer those questions now. He had to focus on staying alive, focus on Shadow. The dog was still, his ears perked, his gaze fixed on the shadows. Marcus glanced over his shoulder again, but this time, he didn't just look for movement, he looked for a way out. The alley was a dead end. The street behind him was a maze of dead ends and empty storefronts. Nowhere was safe. The footsteps were so close now that Marcus could feel them in his chest. A steady rhythm like a drumbeat drawing nearer with every second. He wanted to run, he wanted to fight, but neither felt like the right move. He had no idea who was on his tail, but he knew enough to recognize that these people weren't your typical gangsters. They had resources, and they had knowledge, and they weren't about to let him slip away. Suddenly, the first figure appeared. A silhouette, blocking the faint light from the street lamp, tall and imposing. There was no mistaking the air of authority around him, even from this distance. The figure didn't make a sound as he stepped into the alley, but Marcus could see the outline of a gun in his hand, held loosely at his side, like a man who knew he didn't need to use it, yet. Marcus's mind whirled. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready for whatever had just been set in motion. They were closer than ever, and now there was no question. He had no choice but to confront them. As the figure took a step forward, another came into view behind him, then another. 3 of them now. 3 shadows moving in unison, like they were part of the same mind, the same purpose. Marcus knew this wasn't some coincidence. They had him trapped. Shadow barked once, loud and sharp, but Marcus held him back with a firm grip on the leash. He couldn't let the dog get caught up in whatever this was. This wasn't just a street fight anymore. This was the beginning of something much darker, something that would change everything. The first figure stopped a few feet away, his eyes never leaving Marcus. The others were spread out now, moving slowly, carefully, surrounding him. Marcus could feel the heat rising in his chest, his pulse hammering against his ribs. He was cornered, but he wouldn't go down without a fight. The figure in front of him spoke, his voice soft but commanding. "You're not going anywhere, Marcus." The words were simple, but they held weight. They weren't just a threat, they were a promise. And in that moment, Marcus realized that there was no escaping this. No running, no hiding. The man with the hat had known this all along. They weren't just after his skills, they were after him, his mind, his ability to lead, to execute. He had been trained to be a weapon, but now he was a pawn in a much bigger game. Marcus felt a fire spark inside him. He won't be your pawn, he thought. He was done running, done hiding. It was time to face whatever was coming. The tension in the air was thick, and the weight of their eyes pressing down on him felt suffocating. But he wasn't just some soldier anymore. He was Marcus, and he wasn't going to let anyone control him. Not now, not ever. As he stood there, trying to steady his breath, he knew that this was the moment. This was the line he had crossed. The moment he had feared since the day he left the army. The moment when his past would catch up to him, and he would have to decide whether to run again or finally stand his ground. A sharp, quick movement from the shadows caught his attention. A gun was raised. The figure didn't hesitate. But before he could react, a scream rang out from the distance. A car screeching to a halt. Tires burning rubber. Marcus barely had time to register what was happening before a new figure stepped into the scene. This one wasn't part of the group that had been hunting him. He was someone new, someone dangerous. Marcus didn't have time to process who it was or what it meant. He had no choice but to react. The screech of the car tires echoed through the alley, but this time the sound was different. It wasn't the usual screech of a getaway car or a fast-moving vehicle. It was an urgent, desperate sound, like someone was trying to stop something from happening. Marcus barely had time to react, his instincts kicking in as the figure stepped forward from the shadows. The stranger's silhouette was now fully visible, the lights from the car flashing across the alley as the door swung open. At first, Marcus thought it was just another of the gang members, someone else who had come to make sure he didn't slip away. But the figure's movements weren't the slow, calculated steps of the others. No, this person was fast, frantic. Almost frantic enough to break through the cold, controlled demeanor of the gang he had been facing. The newcomer didn't even spare a glance at the group of men surrounding Marcus. His eyes were fixed solely on him, and there was an unsettling familiarity to the way he moved. Without thinking, Marcus instinctively pulled Shadow closer, his fingers tightening on the leash. His heart was racing again, the tension in the air palpable. Every fiber of his being screamed to act, to move, but he stood frozen, unsure of who this new threat was or how much worse things were about to get. The stranger's voice broke the silence, cutting through the thick tension like a knife. "Marcus," he said, the name coming out in a breathless gasp, almost as though he were relieved to find him. "I thought I lost you." Marcus's head snapped up, confusion flashing through his mind. The voice, it was a voice he knew, but one he hadn't heard in years. It didn't make sense. How could this person be here? How could they know him? The stranger stepped closer, his features now fully visible in the dim light. It was a face Marcus never expected to see again. A face from his past. But the sight of it left him more unsettled than relieved. "David," Marcus whispered, his voice tight with disbelief. David, the man standing before him, had once been his closest friend, his confidant. They had fought side by side in the same operations, shared the same missions, and at one point even saved each other's lives. But that was a long time ago. After a mission gone wrong, David had vanished without a trace. No word, no explanation. It was as though he had disappeared off the face of the earth, leaving Marcus with questions that had never been answered. But here he was, alive, standing in front of him with a look in his eyes that was hard to read. "Marcus," David said again, his voice hoarse, almost desperate. "They're after you. You need to listen to me. This is bigger than anything we've ever faced before." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He had been running for so long, trying to escape the ghosts of his past, trying to forget everything he had been trained to do. But now, standing in front of him, was the one person who knew exactly what he was capable of, what he had been trained to do, and he wasn't here for a reunion. The gang members in the alley shifted uncomfortably, their hands twitching near their weapons, but they didn't make a move. It was as if they, too, were unsure of what was happening, or who David was. The figure that had been in control just moments ago, the man with the hat, now stood still, his gaze flicking between Marcus and David. There was an unspoken tension between them, something beyond just the threat Marcus posed, something more personal. David's eyes never left Marcus's. "You don't understand," he said quietly, urgency in his voice. "They're not just after you. They're after everything you've been hiding, everything you were trained to do." Marcus's mind raced. Asterisk everything I was trained to do, asterisk. He wasn't sure if he was ready to hear what came next. He hadn't been ready to confront his past in so long, and now here it was, barreling down on him, pushing him towards something he wasn't sure he could control. The world he had left behind was coming for him, and it wasn't going to stop until it had its answer. "You have to trust me," David said, stepping closer now, his voice low. "There's a reason they're after you, Marcus. It's not just random. This isn't some gang trying to make a name for itself. This is something much bigger. They've been watching you, waiting for you to slip up." Marcus clenched his jaw, his fingers still gripping Shadow's leash. "What do you mean? What's happening?" David's eyes flicked nervously toward the men surrounding them, and his voice dropped to a whisper. "This isn't just about you, Marcus. You're part of something much bigger. You always have been. They know your training, your skills, they know what you're capable of, and now they need you to finish what you started." Marcus shook his head. "I'm not doing anything for them. I'm not part of anything anymore." David's face twisted with frustration. "You don't get it. They're coming after you because you're the only one who can stop them. You're the key, the only one with the skills, the knowledge. They've been planning this for years, Marcus. You were part of it all along." Marcus felt the floor drop out from beneath him. Asterisk what? Asterisk. The only thing that was clear was that everything he had believed about his life, about the escape he had made from his past, was a lie. He wasn't free. He never would be. He stepped back, shaking his head, trying to process what David was saying, but the pieces weren't fitting together. The tension in the alley had reached its peak now. The gang members, sensing something was shifting, began to move in closer. But this time, it wasn't just about them. It wasn't just about Marcus running anymore. The stakes had changed. David reached into his jacket, his eyes never leaving Marcus's. "They're about to make their move," he said urgently. "And when they do, there's no turning back. You don't have a choice anymore." The world seemed to close in around Marcus, the walls of the alley pressing in tighter with each passing second. The weight of David's words, the heaviness of the situation, threatened to crush him. He didn't know who to trust. He didn't know what was real. But one thing was clear, his past was coming for him, and there was no way to outrun it this time. Before Marcus could react, the sound of an engine revved to life again, louder this time, unmistakable. A vehicle pulled up quickly, and Marcus felt a cold shiver run down his spine as he saw it clearly now. It wasn't just a car. It was a military-grade truck, armored, imposing. And as the headlights flashed toward him, he saw them, more figures emerging from the shadows. This wasn't just a gang. This was something far worse. David's hand shot out, grabbing Marcus's arm. "Move now," he hissed. Marcus didn't wait for another word. His body moved on its own, instinct taking over. The situation had escalated beyond anything he could have imagined, and now survival was the only thing that mattered. They had to get out of there. They had to get out before everything they knew came crashing down around them. The engine's roar was deafening, cutting through the thick air as Marcus and David sprinted down the alley, their feet pounding against the pavement. Shadow, faithfully following, barked sharply, his senses heightened by the growing chaos. The armored truck was moving fast, its headlights illuminating everything in its path, casting long, eerie shadows across the street. The men in the alley were no longer just standing around. They were closing in, forming a deadly perimeter, leaving no escape. Marcus's heart raced, his mind racing even faster. He hadn't expected any of this. The people chasing him, the sudden appearance of David, the vehicle that had just appeared. They were all part of something much bigger, something more sinister than anything he'd ever been involved in. The threat was real, immediate, and escalating at a terrifying pace. David pulled him sharply toward a narrow side street, his grip on Marcus's arm like a vice. "We have to keep moving," he shouted, his voice strained with urgency. But Marcus wasn't listening to him anymore. His mind was fixed on one thing, the truck. The truck that had just parked in the alley and now had its headlights trained on them. There was no doubt in Marcus's mind anymore. This was not some gang trying to carve out territory. This was organized, military-grade force. They were after something specific, and Marcus was the key to it all. As they veered down the side street, the truck's headlights blinked, cutting through the darkness like a blade. The men in the alley were getting closer now, moving with a precision that was unnerving. The walls of the alley closed in around them, making every step feel more desperate. David suddenly stopped, spinning around to face Marcus. His expression was unreadable, his eyes flicking between Marcus and the approaching truck. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, voice thick with emotion. "You're the one they've been waiting for. You always have been. This isn't just about you being a soldier. This is bigger. This is about a mission, about power, about control. You've been trained to lead them." Marcus felt his breath catch in his chest. "What mission? What the hell are you talking about?" David's face hardened. "It's too late for answers now. But I'll tell you this, you weren't just some asset. You were the asset. The one they knew could make everything happen. And now they've come to collect." Marcus could barely process the words. The feeling of betrayal washed over him in waves. He had been trained, yes, but he had never known the full extent of the mission, the true reason behind it. And now, everything he had fought to escape, everything he had tried to forget, was coming back with a vengeance. The sound of the truck's engine revving brought him back to the present. He had no time to dwell on the truth of what David had just revealed. He was running for his life, and there was no time to waste. "We need to move. Now." David nodded, but before they could take another step, a loud shout rang out behind them. The men in the alley were closing in, their guns drawn, and one of them, the man with the hat, was shouting commands. "Don't let them get away." Marcus and David exchanged a glance, and for the first time, Marcus saw the uncertainty in David's eyes. He wasn't just running from these men. He was running from a past that had turned against him too. "David, what's happening?" Marcus asked, his voice harsh with frustration. "Who are they?" David hesitated, his eyes scanning the street as he backed up slowly. "They're not just anyone. They're from the organization," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The same people who trained us. The same people who made us into what we are." Marcus froze. Asterisk the organization, asterisk, his stomach dropped. This wasn't just some random gang. These men, these were the same people who had shaped him, controlled him, turned him into a weapon. They were the ones who had given him his orders, who had taken everything from him. And now they were here to finish what they had started. "You're lying," Marcus spat. "You can't be serious." David's eyes softened, but there was no sympathy there. "I wish I were lying, Marcus, I really do. But you need to understand, there's more at stake than just you and me. They're coming for everyone now, and they're not going to stop until they have what they want." Suddenly, the truck's lights flashed brighter, blinding them both. The vehicle lurched forward, coming to a screeching halt just feet away. The men were moving in, and Marcus had no choice. He had to act, had to make a decision that would determine not only his fate, but possibly the fate of everyone around him. With a desperate glance at David, Marcus made a split-second decision. We're fighting our way out. We don't have a choice. David's jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. They were out of time. The men were too close, and there was no point in running anymore. The only way out was through them. Marcus took a deep breath, stepping forward, his body tightening with tension. Shadow growled low in his throat, sensing the danger. The truck's doors swung open, and two figures stepped out, their faces hidden in the shadows of the vehicle's heavy frame. The men with the guns were still coming, closing in fast. A sudden movement from behind caught Marcus's attention. A figure appeared in the street, one that Marcus didn't recognize at first. But as the figure stepped closer, his heart froze in his chest. The man was wearing the same uniform he had once worn, the same insignia, the same gear. It was one of the soldiers from his past. A man who had once been his teammate. A man who had disappeared, just like David. But now he was here, and he wasn't alone. Before Marcus could say anything, the soldier spoke. "You think you can outrun this? You think you can escape what's coming for you?" His voice was cold, calculating, and it cut through Marcus like ice. David stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "I knew you were still alive, but I never thought you'd come back for this." The soldier didn't flinch. "It's not about what you thought, David. It's about what's happening next." Marcus's heart pounded as the pieces started to fall into place. The organization wasn't just hunting him. They were hunting all of them, and they were about to make sure that none of them left this alley alive. Then, as if to confirm his worst fear, the leader of the gang stepped forward from the shadows, his eyes fixed on Marcus, the man with the hat. He didn't look surprised to see the soldier. In fact, he looked almost relieved. "You're too late," the man with the hat said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "The plan's already in motion. You're just pawns in the game, Marcus. All of you." A sudden realization hit Marcus like a wave. This wasn't about him. This wasn't about survival. This was about something much bigger, something they had all been manipulated into. And now the truth was coming to light in the worst possible way. Before Marcus could respond, a sharp sound cut through the tension, the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. It wasn't from the direction of the men surrounding them. It wasn't from David or the soldier. No, the shot had come from above, from a vantage point that Marcus couldn't see. Everything went still for a moment. Then chaos erupted. The men around them scrambled, disoriented by the gunshot, looking for cover. Marcus felt his heart race even faster as the world seemed to spin out of control. And then, as if it was some twisted game, the last words he heard before the chaos fully unfolded were from David. "This isn't over yet. Not by a long shot." The world went dark. The world was a blur of motion and sound. The gunshot echoed in Marcus's ears, making it hard to process what was happening. The alley, once suffocating and closed in, now felt like a battleground, a place where nothing was certain, where life could be taken in an instant. The air was thick with the scent of danger, a mix of fear, adrenaline, and gunpowder. Marcus's eyes darted around, trying to make sense of the chaos. The figures that had surrounded them were now scattered, ducking for cover, some of them disoriented, others still focused on him. The leader, the man with the hat, was shouting orders, but they were drowned out by the sound of gunfire and the deafening rush of his own heartbeat. David was beside him, his body tense, his eyes scanning the scene with practiced precision. "Move now," he barked, grabbing Marcus's arm once again, pulling him down a narrow passageway that led to an old abandoned building. Marcus followed instinctively, even though every part of him screamed to fight back, to stand his ground. He wasn't sure who he was fighting anymore. Was it the gang, the organization, or something even worse? They reached the building's entrance, and David slammed the door behind them, the sound of it echoing through the empty space. It was a moment of relative peace, but the tension in the air was thick, almost unbearable. Marcus stood still for a moment, trying to catch his breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The world was shifting around him, and every step seemed to take him deeper into a nightmare he wasn't sure he could escape. David, however, wasn't pausing. He was already moving, heading toward the back of the building. "We need to get to the roof," he said, urgency in his voice. "We can't stay here." Marcus nodded, his mind racing, but his body obeying. The roof, he didn't know what that meant, but it felt like their only chance. They weren't safe here, not by a long shot. The building was old, the stairs creaking under their weight as they ascended. As they reached the top, Marcus could hear the sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder, closer. But it wasn't the police they had to worry about. It was the people who had been hunting him, the organization, the soldiers, the gang. Everyone had a piece of the puzzle, and all of them were closing in. David paused at the rooftop door, glancing back at Marcus. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of something that made Marcus uneasy. "You have to understand, Marcus," David said, his voice quiet. "The things you've been running from, they're not going away. They never will." Marcus swallowed hard, his throat dry. "What are you saying?" David hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "I've been trying to protect you, to keep you from the truth, but there's no running from it anymore. You're not just a soldier. You were made for something else. Something that goes beyond anything we've done before." Marcus stared at him, the weight of David's words sinking in. "I never wanted any of this. I just wanted to be left alone." David nodded, as if he understood. "I know. But sometimes the past doesn't give you that option. You're too valuable. To them, to the organization. They've been watching you for a long time. And now they want you back." The urgency in David's voice was clear now. This wasn't just some vague threat. The stakes were real. This wasn't about fighting for survival anymore. It was about something much bigger. Something that Marcus had been a part of, whether he liked it or not. Before Marcus could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from the stairwell. The door to the roof was forced open, and standing there, silhouetted by the light, was the soldier, the one who had spoken earlier, the one who had vanished from Marcus's past. "I see you've made it this far," the soldier said, his tone cold and mocking. "But you won't make it much further." Marcus's heart sank. This wasn't over. Far from it. David's hand moved to his side, his fingers brushing against a hidden weapon. "Get out of here, Jonah," he said, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "This doesn't have to go down like this." Jonah, the soldier's name, smiled coldly. "It's too late for that. We have our orders." Marcus stepped forward, adrenaline surging through his veins. "I don't care about your orders. I just want out." Jonah's smile faltered for a moment. "You can't escape what you are, what you've always been. You've been trained for this, to lead, to destroy." David stepped between them, a warning in his stance. "Enough, Jonah. You're not the one in charge here." Jonah laughed, a harsh, hollow sound. "That's where you're wrong. You never were, David. You never were." Before Marcus could react, Jonah lunged, his movements fast and precise. But David was quicker. The two men collided, the sound of fists hitting flesh filling the air. Marcus could only watch as the fight between them escalated, a brutal display of skill and rage. But this wasn't just a fight. It was something deeper, something personal. The tension between the two men was years in the making, a conflict that had been buried beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to explode. Marcus's gaze flicked to the rooftop's edge. The sirens were getting closer, the tension of the moment thickening with each passing second. He couldn't just stand there. He couldn't keep running. David and Jonah's struggle intensified, but in that brief moment of chaos, Marcus knew what he had to do. He wasn't going to let this continue. He wasn't going to be anyone's pawn anymore. He grabbed David's discarded weapon from the ground, the weight of it heavy in his hands. As he raised it, he hesitated for just a moment, the reality of what he was about to do sinking in. But there was no turning back now. This had to end. In one swift motion, Marcus aimed and fired, the shot ringing out into the night. Jonah collapsed to the ground, his body twitching before falling still. The rooftop was silent for a moment, the echoes of the gunshot fading into the distance. David stood frozen, his breath coming in short gasps as he turned toward Marcus. There was no anger in his eyes, no judgment, just a quiet understanding. "You did what had to be done," David said softly. "But it's not over, it won't ever be over." Marcus nodded, the weight of his actions sinking in. There was no escaping his past. No escaping the choices he had made, the training that had shaped him into someone he wasn't sure he recognized anymore. But in that moment, standing on the rooftop, he realized something important. It wasn't just about the past. It wasn't just about what had been done to him or the people who had shaped him. It was about what he chose to do next. David turned toward the city below, his expression distant. "The organization will keep coming for you. For both of us. They won't stop until they get what they want." Marcus felt the weight of those words. He wasn't free. Not yet. But he had made his choice. He wasn't going to run anymore. He wasn't going to be anyone's weapon. "I'm done running," he said, his voice steady. "I'm done hiding." David glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Then let's finish this." And with that, the two of them turned toward the city, ready to face whatever came next, no longer defined by the past, but determined to carve their own future. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be painless. But it was their fight now, and they would face it together. The city sprawled before them, the lights twinkling in the distance, a reminder of the world they had once known and the world they were about to change. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope.